Well, thanks very much for coming. Introduction was very comprehensive, but to say we've been working in China for around 5 years on a variety of issues, from a carbon capture and storage cooperation with Europe to low carbon zones, which have just been announced across China, covering 350 million people, which is a concept we came up with our partners in China and Chatham House. And a range of, we've operated behind the scenes perhaps in around 3 or 4 EU-China summits, one of which was cancelled, so I'm not sure if that counts or not, but it was, so we've done a lot of diplomacy as well. And what I'm really going to talk today is very much the fruits of that, thinking about China, but also thinking particularly about Europe and China, because Europe is the only scale of organism that China's really interested in engaging with. It's certainly not interested in engaging with the British government on its own, really, strategically. And that's been one of the real problems. So this is the core of my talk. And I'm not going to go through all of the slides, but they're already there as a background for you to take away. So I'm going to cover our firstly a broad strategic context, because you can never understand what China does without that broader context, and what Europe should do without that broader context. Talk a little bit about EU-China interdependencies, a subject we've done a lot of research on. How aligned are we with China's interest as Europe? How much do we understand about our own interests? Then go into the 5-year plan itself as an overview, and then particularly into the industrial strategy part of it. And then talk at the end about some strategic choices I think this raises for Europe and China. What are the practical implications? Obviously, China has lots of practical implications in China, but what practical implications I have on over here? So, the context. The context is it's a much harder world to manage. As the East gets stronger and the West gets weaker, the overall level of responsibility and cooperation in the world is declining. There's lots of people, the core of the global economy is clear, but we can't seem to be able to make rules together anymore. That's a critical issue. Europe has traditionally related to China very much on global issues like human rights or climate change. The US increasingly on Pacific security issues. We disagree with the US on China as a security threat, and generally on how to handle China. We're often aligned in interest, but actually if you look at our tactical engagement on things like economics, we're not really joined up. So there isn't a West against the rest strategy with China, because the West doesn't agree on how to handle China, which I think is actually a good thing, to be honest. And we often, the US and us, one thing we do think, we think about China, how it might be in 2030 or 2050 in the future. Well, China very much sees itself from where it's come from as a developing country. So we think, China, superpower, they think China, developing country. That is partly tactical on both sides, but it's partly real. And that's one of the biggest causes of disagreement, of kind of this perception of each other, how much responsibility people should take, where they should be in the world. And climate change and energy exemplify these trends, and probably at the front end of exemplifying these trends. It's a place where China is a bigger problem than virtually anything else relatively, and has to make some of the biggest changes. So I think there's broader foreign policy issues. We knew we were going to be here. We knew as soon as the developing world started reducing poverty, there would be a resource crunch. In the 1970s, it's arithmetic. China turns out to be the first part of the developing world that really seriously reduced poverty, so China is the one doing resources. I'm not sure what the 70s model said, if it was China or somebody else. It could have been anybody. But there's no business as usual approach. If China used oil at the same level as South Korea or Japan did during their rise, they'd use 70% of global oil supplies by 2030. That's just not going to happen, and China knows this. We're seeing the reality of interconnected food, water, energy, climate change issues, 2008, 2011, stupidity, kind of perfect storms, they've been called. The Chinese leadership knows about this. It knows its stability is vulnerable to resource constraints in energy, to the impacts of climate change. And even though all the major powers lay claim to a rules-based system, though after the Doha round collapse, perhaps do they still, everybody, including Europe and the US and China and India, all have more strategic-based resource access strategies growing underneath. And so there's a kind of danger of this kind of two-level game where everybody's looking at other countries going, well, look, they don't really believe in rules, because see where they're putting their bases or see what strategic partnerships they're making. So the first casualty of poorly managing the scarcity in the world will be the global rules system. So again, this is a link to the broader, if we don't manage things right, we undermine the overall system, not just the subsystem around energy and climate. So are Europe and China at all aligned on this issue? Yes, we both import a lot of oil from the same places. We don't yet manage them. We're both very vulnerable to climate change, China more so, and more so on its own landmass. Europe's very regionally vulnerable. We supply most of the technology and innovation to China in this area, especially in infrastructure. Our demographics require China to carry on growing to pay our pensions. China requires, its demographics are peaking, it needs to go up the value chain. So we need a successful China that sees the global rules-based system as essential for its security, because that's the only space Europe survives in too. And the large proportion of Chinese thinkers also agree with that. I'd say there are more national, kind of great powerists in China than there are in Europe, though precisely how many would be interesting to have a discussion on. Oh, and that didn't come out at all. That is a map of climate vulnerability that has not worked. Sorry, it's probably the transfer to a Mac, but just shows that China is very vulnerable. But that's the theory. What's the reality? To keep climate change below 2 degrees, China must peak its emissions between 2020 and 2030. This is deeply unfair. No one has tried to do this at that stage of their development, but it's just a physical fact. There's no other way it's going to happen. The thing is, the Chinese leadership has really yet to commit to 2 degrees. I mean, everybody signed up to 2 degrees in international agreements, but actually there's a very strong discussion about what is the optimal level of climate change for China and in India. And the US hasn't either, and I would say even Europe hasn't really committed to 2 degrees in terms of its real trajectory of emissions. That's one of the real issues. But the heart of our disputes at Copenhagen, and Europe-China was the most public dispute really, was about fairness and the economic feasibility of meeting a 2-degree trajectory. And I think that's where it's often glossed over, but this is a really serious decision that no major government has really faced up to. And this is just showing that comparing UK, US, EU, and Turkey, because I was polling on China. And you see the US sees China far more negatively, especially on issues like climate change and conflict, than the EU, which is generally more sympathetic towards China. But overall, our relationship is, as rebuilding would be the say. Copenhagen was a diplomatic disaster for different reasons for both China and the EU. I think China was slightly better at rehabilitating itself after Copenhagen. However, China's biggest disaster was it made a generation of European leaders distrust it face to face. And that was a really, really bad piece of diplomacy, because those personal reflections of Merkel and others will not go away very fast. The European public sees China as a problem rather than a threat, which is different to the US. But we don't have an affinity with China, and that's different. And we lack confidence in our diplomacy with China, actually, despite quite a lot of successes. And that's the real backdrop to how we engage, because trust and confidence is really the heart of this. So, okay, that's the context. What about the 12 5-year plan? Well, it exists. It was approved in March. It is fundamentally the underpinning of legitimacy of the Communist Party, and that's what it's for. And the context is really the working population peaking by 2017, and the need to move from a focus on quantity of growth to the quality of development across a range of circumstances, including on the environment energy side, but also on social care elsewhere. That is the fundamental thing happening. It is an incredibly ambitious and complex thing to try and do. It's much easier to copy than to go up the quality route. And I think some people assume that, I think the likelihood of this 5-year plan being met is very quantitatively different to the likelihood of the previous 5-year plans, which are much more about rolling out proved techniques. It's much more like the move to a market economy with all the risks involved. And I think it's pretty clear that the Chinese leadership understand that. They understand it's a different beast. It is very green, and I'm going to go through this, but lots of nice targets about reducing things. They also know that command and control has finished. So there's some command and control in trying to meet these targets, but also starting to look at developing markets and innovation and different types of incentive. Again, qualitative difference in change. In their energy intensity target, which is very key, one of the core issues is it's looking at structural change in industries, moving to the service sector as a bigger driver than technology, or a larger driver this time than technology was, or a shift from less reliance on technology solutions that could be rolled out through to command to this things that are much more socially involvement. If they meet their targets, they will be bigger than the reductions Europe will take in gigaton terms. This is a developing country doing non-binding things, as opposed to a developed country in the Kyoto Protocol. It's interesting, comparable. So, but the key there, China will be a comparable or larger market for low-carbon goods and services than the EU. The EU is in kind of forefront of low-carbon business because it has the largest market, not because we're the cleverest people in the world. So this is, and this is a good thing, but it does mean that that's And that's a strategic advantage which the Chinese are looking at. They will still, however, use a lot of coal, and the coal use will grow. So I don't think this is not a 2-degree trajectory. All these targets don't add up to 2 degrees. They don't add up to a fundamental restructuring. Are they as fast a restructuring as it could happen? I don't know. I've never restructured an economy before. Lots of people have opinions, but again, these are the issues. However, we have a lot of investment in nuclear well until Fukushima. We'll see how that rolls out. Hydro takes the biggest weight in terms of capacity, and wind power. There is a huge amount of investment going to go in. Essentially, China will match Europe's investment in renewables, but trump us in infrastructure and smart and supergrids because they're building a new system. That's one of their advantages. Over this area. Go away. Sorry, that's the problem of having your clock on your phone. You have to keep it on. And the good thing about the Chinese goals on supergrids and smart grids and R&D is they're all funded, whereas the European goals are all unfunded, and increasingly unfunded when I go to Brussels. So we've got great aspirations. Our aspirations are similar, but theirs aspirations are actually funded. And the reason is because theirs are part of their industrial strategy and driven by their industrial strategy, where Europe's are driven by their climate change strategy and seen by many European policymakers as being at odds with our industrial strategy, if you look at the quotes from the various European directors. So that's why the industrial strategy is so critical in understanding how this fits into China's view of the world. So the critical part of the industrial strategy is those 7 pillar industries. And of those, you can say 6 of the 7 are deeply green. So the green sector, new energy, alternative energy vehicles, energy saving and environmental protection. However, the next 3 are also highly connected, especially in terms of market growth, advanced materials, high-end manufacturing, new generation information technology. The real growth is going to come from the core green sectors, but the others are facilitatory. And then we have biotechnology, which is partly green, partly not green. This is a European presentation, so we've got it not green. Saves me arguing to the Green Party, which it was originally designed for. And there's a huge, I won't go for the numbers, huge lots of numbers about huge amounts of money going into these areas. But some of the interesting pieces, value added of these industries expected to rise from around 3% at the moment to 8% of GDP by 2015 and 15% by 2020. That's quite an enormous increase in share, remembering the economy is growing around 9%, 7% at this point. Huge use of state development banks, how efficient that investment will be. Interesting on which industry, which companies they will invest in. Very interesting. Again, lots of money into RD&D. Large-scale demonstration projects. As I said, we've worked on this idea of low-carbon zones. There's now 12 of them officially piloting across China, covering 350 million people. Innovating new regulatory, economic, market systems. Developing low-carbon economies for China, because they're different to our economies. And lots of support for mergers and acquisitions of foreign companies. We can't agree to do technology transfer to China, so China's going to come and get technology transfer from us. Though actually, you look at it, it's a very inefficient way to do technology, M&A. Actually doesn't transfer that well if you look at the literature. So there's lots of money going in. The question is, how efficient will it be? And how effective will it be at driving change? Some people, there's recent reports just come out saying China's not going to be that innovative. I think that's very backward looking. If you look really backward and see when China was the top technological power in the world across all new advanced technologies in the 18th century, it seems very unlikely this will have no dividend. Doubtless it will not be all well spent. But it's sort of like people talking about Korea and Japan and saying they'll never do anything but copy. Well, they turned out to be a very poor prediction of where their industries were going. I imagine there will be significant results. So what's happening in terms of policy environment as a summary of these things? China is converging with the EU in terms of market scale. And it aspires to compete in high-end areas of manufacturing because it sees a gap in the market. It sees growing markets which are not dominated by existing developed country firms, and that's why it's aiming in this space. It's betting on that low clean energy, low carbon. It is much better than the EU at integrating its growth, energy security, and climate change policies, which is why they're more likely to deliver. The problem with Europe is climate change has become detached from its growth strategy, and that's why we're now experiencing lots of problems trying to get the climate change stuff through and lots of pushback. It's backing its plans with money, which is useful. And it's growing its low-carbon markets, whereas Europe is arguing about whether we should grow our low-carbon markets, moving from 20 to 30% of reductions. So let's not downplay the huge challenges China faces in meeting its goals, but it's very clear that Europe at the same time is failing to build on its advantages. It's already in front on the low carbon race, and China aspires to catch up. Well, we know China will probably catch up a bit, and half of that will probably be because Europe's not building on its own lead. But that's a strategic decision. If you do it on cost-benefit analysis, you're not going to get the answer Europe should do it. What game is Europe playing is a really critical issue. So what does that turn into strategic choices? The first one is, let's recognise that we're here because Europe had a good idea of solving climate change. This is a massive success of international diplomacy, much bigger than anything the US has achieved over the last decade. China would not be doing all this if the EU hadn't maintained, through keeping Kyoto on track, doing its domestic policy, a perception that the world was going to move on climate change and clean energy was doable and possible. So lots of opportunities for European low-carbon leaders to get in there. Lots of areas where China's investing already in Europe. So good thing China's moved because Europe made it credible the world was going to move on this. This will accelerate global decarbonisation, drive down the cost of things, but obviously represents real competition. Well, why wouldn't it? That's what we'd expect. But sometimes people say, oh, the Chinese will move to a low-carbon economy and we'll just sell them the stuff and they won't want to do any manufacturing. And that is a model people had in their heads, which was a little bit unconvincing, but sometimes. So basically the challenges this raises is really more competition. China will aim to be a market leader, especially in supplying developing countries. Developing countries, emerging economies, 70% of global investment in low carbon over the next 20 years because they're building their infrastructure. It doesn't matter what targets they take. Any sensible country looking forward, risk managing its economic portfolio to a high oil price, carbon constrained world will be shifting to cleaner tech, even if it's not taken any targets. Be a stupid country and not do that and then face the liabilities, but that's what we're seeing. So again, China's going to really focus on those and competing in that area. Depends whether our companies can start producing cheaper versions of what they sell with less safety. I mean, this is one of the really interesting industrial battles. We know that their innovation policies are reducing access to the markets, and there's a big fight ongoing about how government purchasing and company purchasing agreements in China will decrease access from European firms. There's been a successful intervention by the Commission to open up those markets and stop some of these more protectionist policies coming in. But we're also seeing protectionist murmurs on the European side relative to Chinese mergers and acquisitions. We're looking at a place where we're driving massive industrial shifts through government subsidy, whether that's by charge on consumers, through emissions trading, or direct subsidies from banks or RD&D. Everybody's doing it. So there is no free market in this space. So the amount of the potential for kind of protectionism and perceptions of protectionism and trade tensions are huge. But there's no way around. The only way you can drive this is through this kind of support. It doesn't work otherwise. And carbon leakage, the old idea that our industries are going to go abroad to China and compete with them, complete distraction. Numbers don't add up. China's not planning, as we can see, to grow on the back of heavy industry exports. It exports 1% of its cement manufacture, which is 50% of global cement. Their steel and cement is for domestic use. There was occasional bubbles where it spilt over, which were due to regional decisions. But it's not. The countries that really want to use subsidised energy to use this for their core growth plan are Russia, Ukraine, Turkey, perhaps Brazil going forward. Those are the places we have carbon leakage issues with, not so much China. So let's stop talking about it because it gets in the way of talking about the trade problems we really have. So what are our strategic choices? We've got long-term interests, but we haven't worked out a way of cooperating on it yet. So we've got a bad relationship. So a lot of alignment there. How do we turn that into an agreement? We've had a lot of influence on China as EU, but that's mainly been through doing stuff at home and our ability to keep the global process moving on climate change, have a credible perception, credible expectation of carbon limits globally. We've paid a lot of political costs for that. That's cost us a lot of money, billions of euros, but worked. Our cooperation directly with China has had a pretty low impact, and we've got a low reputation with delivery from the Chinese side. But we need China to raise its ambition. So, we need a strategy that can achieve that Chinese raising of ambition that is much more strategic, high level and focused, and now much more focused on helping China implement some of its goals in a way that is still supporting and doesn't cut across our competition issues. So the industrial and the public good and the private good issues start to become very difficult to manage. You can't avoid them. So what could our strategic goals be? We want China to believe a global rules-based system is essential for delivering its security. That's important. We want it to decide by 2015 that moving to a 2 degrees trajectory is credible and its national interests. And we want an EU-China agreement that makes equitable rules-based trade in this area work, which is harder than one think, actually. And there's a bunch of specific things I won't go into on those. We have an external action service that is trying to build an agenda, a new agenda for China as an example of how Europe does foreign policy. It's done some quite innovative things we can talk about creating that agenda. And it wants to use this year's EU-China summit, which I think is in November, to move that forward, to start talking about energy security perhaps, to talk about low carbon trade and investment, to move beyond the kind of usual human rights, Taiwan, and arguments about these things in Copenhagen. It is a real opportunity, but it's also, and people in the External Action Service realise it's a bit of a risk, because if they fail to do this, they'll lose some credibility with the member states. However, none of the member states can deliver an agenda on this scale, because the core nexus is around trade, and trade is European competence, and Europe's only interesting when it's Europe scale to China on this issue. So, in a situation where we have a classic combination of a need to be extremely clear strategically and manage a lot of public and private interests and maintain a long-term direction, which is precisely what the External Action Service was created to do. So my takeaway from this is, it might not happen this year, but I think this year will be the beginning of a conversation to say, can we grip a really clear issue, it's very high priority for Europe, we've got a good track record of success with our major trading partner, and actually do a serious strategic job? Because if we can't do it on this one, I don't see how we're going to do it on the other issues which we need Europe to grip in terms of global diplomacy, which are much less high profile and therefore will capture much less political will in deserving it. Thank you. And you can find an awful lot of papers on our website.